Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Hey there, I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and on this episode, trauma. What is it? How do we provide services to victims of trauma? And how can we prevent trauma from occurring? We have renowned author and founder of the Beyond Consequences Institute, Heather Forbes. She's an expert on trauma and provides guidance to school districts and other organizations. One quick note, we'll be taking a break for a few weeks during the holidays, but in January, we'll mark our 1-year anniversary, and we have some truly amazing guests scheduled in 2019. As always, we're looking for your input. Get in touch with us via Facebook or Instagram at Mind Matters Podcast, or on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod. There's also a contact form at our website, mindmatterspodcast.com. We're talking trauma next. This is Mind Matters.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters,
The gifted guru, Lisa Van Gamert.
I was the typical gifted kid perfectionist, not wanting to play with toys, but rather just organize them. I watched an episode of Hoarders with my husband. The woman being interviewed said, "Well, I'm a perfectionist." To my husband, that made no sense whatsoever. How could she be a perfectionist? And I understood completely, because sometimes perfectionism manifests itself in this complete throwing in of the towel.
Would you say that perfectionism is inherently a negative quality or a negative trait to be overcome? Are there instances where it can be viewed in a more positive way?
So you've asked the most controversial question among academicians researching perfectionism.
that's episode 6, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Trauma comes in many different forms. It can happen earlier in life than most people realize, and the impacts of trauma aren't always recognized immediately. Today's guest will help us feel our way through this subject.
Hi, I'm Heather Forbes. I am the author of a series of books of working with children with trauma and their histories, and I am a licensed clinical social worker based out of Boulder, Colorado.
How do you define trauma, and what are some of the examples of types of events that can cause trauma in kids?
We tend to think of trauma as that it has to be something really big. Well, it's not always the event itself. It really is more about the perception of the event going on within that child's experience. So that can mean obviously something like foster care or adoption. Those are very obvious traumatic events. But when we look at children who experience just a lot of chaos in the home, it might be an intact family. However, it's a home that is very chaotic. Things are unpredictable. And so we have to look at the child's perception. And there's 3 words I always put to that. To define trauma as an experience that puts a child in a place of feeling hopeless, helpless, or powerless. And so instead of defining the experience itself, start looking at it from that perspective. I mean, it seriously can be something as a child riding down the sidewalk and they fall off their bike and they think they're going to die. Like, that can be a traumatic experience, but they've also done studies where they know where, let's say there's a burning house and a fireman goes in and he rescues this child out of the house, and the fireman picks up that child and says, "We got it, we're good," and he takes that child out of the house. An experience like that can actually be less traumatic because it's within the context of a relationship. That child feels that someone is going to make it all okay, and then you have less of an impact later on. So it's nothing that is actually logical at all. It's very much something that is based at the emotional level.
And sometimes maybe the outcome, like what happens, how is it resolved?
Yes. And how is it resolved within the context of a relationship? That's also a really important piece. And let me back up also as far as some of the experiences themselves that I want us to always to start considering is that it may be something even like within utero, the growing of that baby with inside the mother's body. And is that mother stressed out? Is she feeling just overwhelmed at work? Is she under domestic violence? Is she not even wanting that pregnancy? And so all that is highly magnified with cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So that also has to be taken in consideration. And then also the birth experience. And I go way back to these early parts of life because those are the types of traumas that we have sort of negated. We've said, oh, well, they don't remember. Oh, they do remember. And in fact, that's when we start seeing 8 years later, when that child is in 3rd grade, all of this early trauma starts falling apart inside the classroom or inside the home. So trauma doesn't have a timeline. We have to start way back at the conception and then follow the journey of development all the way through to that child's progress through life.
So what was it that brought you to researching and understanding trauma, and what has made you kind of feel so passionate about why it's important for schools to understand it?
You know, this all came out of my own personal experience. I originally was doing architectural work, and so here I am talking about trauma with you, right? So, I originally, we adopted a little boy out of Russia, and he was 2.5 years old, had been in the orphanage since birth, and I brought him back into a home, and I was in Florida at the time, thinking, oh, I'll just sort of pick up here. Well, my house completely fell apart, and I had no concept of what that kind of childhood trauma did to a 2.5-year-old. And then ultimately we adopted another child out of pure insanity or just, I don't know, desperation. And so, I've raised 2 children that had severe trauma, physical trauma, emotional trauma, abuse, neglect, abandonment. And so the journey of getting them through to that place of healing and getting them through school even and getting them just to be able to function in the world. I will fast forward my story. They're both actually 24 now and they're doing really well. And I am also proud to say that they're both college graduates, but that didn't just happen by just signing your child up for school and going about it the normal way. So all that came out of my experience of really struggling as a parent, not knowing what to do, and really doing a lot of research into the neuroscience of what happens to a child's brain, what happens to their belief system, what happens to their body. All that impacts then how a child reacts and how they think and how they function in the world.
Since trauma can happen in utero or when our kids are away from us, it's often hard to know if or when a child has been subjected to a traumatic event. It often comes down to educating mental health professionals and teachers on how to recognize the signs of trauma.
My heart goes out to parents, especially who are raising children who from the surface look just like the child next door. And when you go to a professional and you're like, well, something's not right here. They look at you like maybe you're the problem, like you're the parent that's just sort of being the drama mama. And so I think that there's just not enough education out there in the professional fields of all different aspects of understanding from a very broad, holistic perspective. And so I think for parents that are struggling to be able to find that answer, and it really absolutely does come through the traumatic experiences. And I want to make sure that professionals then that are interacting with parents can be able to suggest and to open up a conversation around that.
You know, obviously here on this podcast, we talk about, I think, another area there's a lack of awareness about, which is the gifted and high ability learners. So we're going to kind of be tying those two things together.
And I think that is because they are so high on the cognitive scale, their IQ, that the expectation for these children is much higher, where socially, emotionally, especially, there's a much larger gap. And so it really is a disservice to our children because they're brought to this higher level that maybe their peers are not, simply because at one level of their development, they're highly charged up, but the other level, they're really struggling.
They have heightened emotional intensity. How do you feel that plays into how a gifted kid might experience certain events that may be traumatic?
Well, I think it only amplifies everything because, like you said, they're just tuned up, they're charged up, and that's part of the gift, is that they have this high sensitivity. And, I kind of reflect back on this in my own personal history. I come from a family, I think all 5 of us were gifted and we're actually raised in a pretty traumatic family. So I look back, and when I was looking to do this podcast with you, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like my story. This isn't even my kid's story. And so, I was highly, highly sensitive. And so when something traumatic happens, it only magnifies the scale of it. And when you don't have a very strong relationship-based family or school environment, then that child is very much left to their own devices to try to figure it out. And being cognitively aware is one thing, but having the tools in your toolbox to be able to understand how to work through the emotional impact, how to process that, how to understand your body through all that, that's the piece that I don't think we teach any of our students and our children. So for a child that has been labeled gifted, and they're going to have that just high sensitivity, that we then have to really step back and open our hearts at a much broader level and stop expecting our children just to sort of get over it. Well, you're smarter than that. You're better than that. Those kind of comments need to stop immediately. We need to go down to the heart level and connect with our kids in a deep, very safe, emotionally charged relationship level.
Especially with the kids who are very highly verbal, we talk at them.
Yes.
But this is not about logic. This is not about talking. It's about emotion and about feeling and about experiencing.
And I also think, Emily, that a lot of our children, because they are intellectualized, that they will try to cover it up. Mm-hmm. And so there's probably a lot of things brewing underneath, and all of a sudden you go, well, oh my gosh, by the time they were 15, they just blew out. And it's like, no, that didn't just happen. We didn't have those conversations and move that child into a different area, because they're going to feel very comfortable speaking about things at an intellectual, cognitive level. And we got to move our kids and open up a different area so that those kinds of things don't keep brewing up underneath the surface.
Trauma doesn't just color our opinions or alter our perceptions. It literally changes our brains. Trauma floods our senses. Fight or flight releases hormones, changes blood flow, and forms new neural pathways.
It happens because of survival. When you were 5 years old and you have to figure out how to feed yourself and your siblings, you're going to become pretty astute on how the world works. So when you think about some of these situations, that especially with the children I've worked with, it's of course, it's like, oh, that does start to make sense, that's why they have developed that part of their brain. But then when we look and if we do any testing with them, what we'll find is that there's pockets that are so underdeveloped. They've built up this very strong part of their brain. And that's where the wiring change happens, is that based off their situations and the predictability of the environments, that's where their brains are going to then be very strong. But when they're not challenged in different areas just simply because of survival, then those parts of the brains aren't going to be, there's not, they say basically that's where the blood flow goes. You're going to flow that blood, and those neural pathways are going to be laid down in whatever environment. It's really, I think we have to get back from that sense of, oh, is it nature or nurture? Oh, they're genetically this way. What we know from neuroscience now is that the genetic material is still unwinding 2.5 months out from the delivery. So for the first 2.5 months of that child's life, if they have a genetic predisposition to something, it's going to be impacted by the environment. And so that's really important to look at, those early childhood experiences. That really sets the blueprint for how they're going to be wired and how they see the world.
As we mentioned, traditional examples of trauma, things like neglect or the loss of a family member, sometimes end up having less of an impact for some people than, for instance, being in an extremely challenging advanced level course. Trauma affects everyone differently and at different stages of development.
Because underneath it all, these are still children. We are the only species that takes 25 years to develop into an adulthood. I mean, that's what brain science is telling us, that the brain does not fully maturate until you're 25 years old. So again, even if you are gifted, like you said, you're put into these high stressful situations, the courses in high school or college level classes that they're taking, and the pressure and which is just stress. They're put into highly, highly stressful situations where their body systems are still technically a child's body that doesn't know how to deal with that kind of stress. And so, again, the more support, I think, I'm always looking at solutions. Then what is the solution to that? Yes, our children need to be challenged intellectually, but what I think we've missed underneath it is understanding that they are still children and they need very much a strong relationships, whether it's parent-child relationships, teacher-child relationships, mentor. They need a village around them to be able to navigate through those highly stressful, intellectually charged environments that we put them in.
Another thing that I sometimes see with these kids is that maybe they have a hard time making friends with same-age peers because of their personality or their interest, or maybe they've been bullied in the past. I feel like those can also be traumatic events. What suggestions do you have for parents or teachers or even kids for themselves to help kind of manage those situations, maybe proactively prevent them, but also recover if they have experienced those?
The more that we can develop their social skills, the better. And again, because I think there's so much emphasis on the academics and the intellectual piece that we forget that they still need to learn, how do you interact with someone? What does that conversation look like? How do you be able to read other people from not just an intellectual standpoint, but also then from more of a, that sort of sixth sense? Because our kids are very sensitive, so they have the capacity, I think, to put around the training around that. And that sounds kind of weird. Like, well, don't kids just figure out how to get along with each other?
If only.
If only, right? And, it's sort of like, if kids are arguing in the playground or in the courtyard, whatever the social environment is, that we just assume that they'll figure it out. Well, no, they really don't. Mm-hmm. So I highly suggest that parents and therapists and mentors or anyone, you really look at the development of their social skills. And what does that look like? There's tons and tons of resources available. And this may sound weird that I'm going to recommend this, but I think there are so many awesome resources for children who have been diagnosed with autism that can be used in all other aspects, even for our children at the high end of the gifted. And the reason I say that is that this may not be something that comes naturally, just like for a child that's diagnosed with autism. It's the social connection. It just doesn't seem that it's an easy flow for them. So use resources that have been developed for some of our other children for our gifted kids as well. So does that sound a little weird, Emily? Or?
Not to me, because I agree with you 100%. I have found a lot of resources, like Michelle Garcia-Winner has so many different things, and I use those with all of my clients at the office, whether they're on the autism spectrum or ADHD or just kind of quirky gifted, whatever it is, because you're right. I think that just that understanding the social relationships is huge.
And that also helps them in the academic environment. If we can help them settle down that social level, bring that down to something that is more manageable, they're going to have more of their resources available to be able to navigate again through the highly charged up academic environments. And again, that's just something we've completely missed. And I reflect back to, a lot of the students in my gifted class and myself. We didn't know how to interact. We had no clue how to. So, and I think back, my gosh, what if when I went home, instead of doing homework every day, someone in my family had just stepped in and said, hey, we're going to do a little role playing here. We're going to talk about conversations. What's the art of conversation, the art of listening, so that I wouldn't have been sort of that quirky. I think you use that word, which is a great word, because children like this, they know they don't fit in. They know that they're different. And what is one thing that every child wants to be is, quote, normal. They want to fit in. And when you know you don't, and you don't have the skill set, it just puts you in a very, very negative framework about your belief system, about who you are. You don't fit in the world. You're not lovable. You're not okay. You're not all right. And so then children start developing a very negative perception of themselves, which is absolutely detrimental to every other aspect of their life.
The other piece of it, of course, is these kids who are both gifted and have another diagnosis, so they're twice exceptional. Maybe they're gifted and they have dyslexia, or they're on the autism spectrum or have ADHD. And so whether their learning difficulty has been masked by their ability or the other way around, how does that play into the world of trauma with these kids?
Yeah, it's just one more layer. And that's why I call this complex trauma. There's nothing simple about it. It's not like, oh, they're just this and we're going to deal with this one issue. It is something we have to look at from a holistic spectrum. So, if they are also have something like ADHD or dyslexia, that alone is hard. But then you add layer after layer after layer. You look at the family situation, there's another layer. You look at their early birth experience, there's another layer. So again, I say back up, take a bird's eye view, and understand that this is going to impact so much rather than just the one diagnosis or the one subject or the one thing. It's that perception of who they are. When children get to that 8 or 9 year old stage, and developmentally, again, that's something we always have to look at, their developmental stages. But at that stage of especially, we all go through that existential question of, who am I and why am I here on this earth? And so those diagnoses play a huge impact into how they look at themselves in the mirror and how they feel like they fit into the world. So I just want to continue to just stress that the more that we can help our children be able to connect in relationship, be able to have that strong, safe, connected bond, that when these questions come up, that they have someone to go to be able to talk to. And I think that's the other piece, is that what does that conversation look like? Because if you are the parent of a child like that, you're automatically going to want to jump in and go, oh no, honey, you're really smart. You're so important. You're funny, you're intelligent, you're fun. And we sort of discard that they're feeling those negative feelings. So the conversation around that needs to be, oh my gosh, I didn't think of it from that perspective. Tell me more. Mm-hmm. And the child says, oh, well, I'm dyslexic or I'm stupid, but you tell me I'm gifted. I don't fit in the world. And we just say, well, tell me more. Where do you see that? And so as the adult, you want to go into that conversation with a sense of curiosity. You don't want to solve it for them. They're going to figure it out, especially our kids, right? They have a lot of resourcefulness. They will figure this out. They just need a sounding board. They just need to be able to put this out so someone understands them, someone knows them, and then you'll then be able to help them figure all this out on their own.
I know that a lot of schools are starting to train their teachers and administrators in trauma-informed practices. And that's kind of the big thing that I know a lot of people look to you for your expertise. And mental health professionals are being trained in trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy. In a big picture sense, how do you see that shift happening? What does that look like?
It's very encouraging, actually. Because there hasn't been enough emphasis to understand children at the social emotional level, with so much emphasis in our schools, especially on academics. And in order to be able to have those higher test scores and to achieve and reach those high goals, we have to support our children in the social emotional spectrum. So I'm very encouraged that there is a much bigger awareness around this. I will say this, I think there's also not enough understanding of what it means to be in a place of connected relationships with our students. And I know that sounds like, well, what do you mean? Like, of course we're connected with our kids. No, when I walk in schools and I work with parents who are trying to get the special services for their children, it's just very interesting to me how people say, oh yeah, we're trauma informed, but then all of a sudden they're doing everything from a behavioral level and from an intellectual cognitive level. No, this is really, deeply, profoundly a movement that has to be generated at the heart level. And that sounds sort of cushy, sort of marshmallowy, like we're just treating our kids and letting them get away with things. I'd like to look at it this way. How would you treat a preschooler? You're going to be at a much more emotionally connected level with a preschooler, because little kids, they're all emotions. I want us to take that same level and move it through elementary, middle, and high school. But you also then, of course, have to balance it out with the cognitive and the behavioral. It's a balanced system. But somehow we believe that once that child enters kindergarten, that we don't have to be as emotionally connected. And that's where we want to continually make sure this movement doesn't lose that piece of it.
I think that message is getting through to people. I hear people talking, and I think, being a mental health professional, I see the value of that. And that's what I do on a daily basis, right? But I used to be a teacher and I was a school counselor. So I've also kind of seen that gradual change over the years. And when I do see that connection, though, I'm like, okay, people are getting this. They're understanding, like, we have to have this first before we can have any of the other stuff.
Exactly. But I think also when people say, well, I just want some tools to become trauma-informed, and they're looking for like little fidgets and gadgets, and those can be helpful. But again, the most powerful tool any of us has is to open our heart and jump into their world from a very opened, emotionally connected way. And it's really simple, but it's actually one of the hardest things to ever do.
Carl Rogers with the unconditional positive regard. I think sometimes kids have these behaviors that come out of this, the trauma or the other experiences or whatever. And it's frustrating, for us as adults. We have to be able to set that aside. And that's, I think, sometimes the hardest thing. We just want to fix the problem.
It is. And I think that also talks to our own fear. Our fear that, oh my gosh, this child's not going to be able to make the right grade or go to the right school or get into the Ivy League or whatever. Or I'm not going to be perceived as a good parent because my child can't behave in the classroom. And so when I walk into open house, they're going to be like, oh, you're Billy's mother. This is not a conversation only about our children. This is so much a conversation also about ourselves. And to, not from a blaming standpoint, but I think from a very empowering standpoint to say, wow, if I can't be at a more open level and not sort of, give solutions and disregard some parts of my child, then what's my own fear? Because actually the more that we can address ourselves, the more that we get into a place of balance, a place of mindfulness, understanding ourselves, the much better that our children can do that as well. Children learn from modeling. So the more that we are understanding and responding to our own bodily reactions, our own fears, that's actually how we're going to teach our children to do that as well.
And I imagine that even for the kids who aren't necessarily survivors of trauma, if they're in a trauma-informed school or they have parents who are, kind of aware of this and are, I think it's good for everybody.
It is. And that's why when I do a lot of work with schools, and most of them are coming in the very beginning because they have a high population of children who have a lot of history of trauma or current histories. But then they're like, oh, but this will really help our other students as well. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always like, yes, if this helps the child that is very challenging, then of course it's going to also do nothing but help the child that is, again, more that typical child. Because what we're doing is we're helping children learn how to be more mindful, how to be able to understand how to deal with stress, how to be able to understand their own sort of hot spots and their own buttons to be pushed. And those skills are skills that we use throughout our entire lifetime. All of us go through states of high arousal when we get pretty, what I call, dysregulated. And as adults, we have learned how to deal with stress. Hopefully, some of us just drive through Starbucks, but, there's a lot of internal mechanisms that we can use to be able to deal with our stress. So we just live in a very stressful time in human history that the more that we can help identify how to deal with stress and how to work with our own bodies and our own reactivity, those are skill sets that help all our children once they're actually in that, quote, adult world in the real world. So I think that we just have to get back to the basics of who we are from a human species. We are biologically designed to be in community. We are a social creature. And so the more that we can be able to connect with our children, understand them, help them to understand that we know who they are, hold that space for them, they then can be able to live the life that they need to live at their fullest potential. But it takes as simple as connecting at the heart.
Heather Forbes, founder of the Beyond Consequences Institute and author of several books on trauma and emotional regulation. Thanks for joining us.
To reach the Mind Matters podcast, go to our website, mindmatterspodcast.com, and click on Contact. Follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod, on Facebook @Mind Matters Podcast, or you can reach our YouTube channel through our website. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Trauma can come in many shapes and forms, and it impacts people from birth through adulthood. Whether it's a child who's been neglected and without food, or a teen who's experienced a sexual assault, The emotional scars from the events last longer than the physical injuries. At the time we recorded this episode, we just learned that Jason Kander, a nationally known and well-respected candidate for mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, withdrew from the race due to the effects of trauma from his time served in the military 11 years ago. We just can't know when or how these events will come back to us, or how they'll impact us. We have to be on the lookout for the signs of trauma and work with kids to develop a trusting and safe relationship where they know that they won't be rejected if the trauma from their past bubbles to the surface. And the need for trauma-informed practices extends even beyond the schools. Law enforcement agencies and medical professionals also benefit from using trauma-based tools to work with survivors. We have to recognize that our high-ability learners face a wide range of situations that many others may not consider as a possible trauma-inducing event. Individuals with heightened emotionality have the potential to be both more vulnerable to the threats of trauma and also to build an increased resilience to it when we provide the support they need. To find the answers to heal trauma, we have to ask the right questions. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time on Mind Matters.
We sat on the roof. You said you'd try to explain. You told me all your secrets. Then you said it would rain. And now I'm standing there without a clue. 'Cause I thought I knew every single part of you. How does it hurt? Like tearing up a hole inside you. For what it's worth. Yeah, I know what you're going through. What can I do? To get over it for something new to take its place. Let's make the most of it, me and you. We're gonna steer this boat to safe land. I'll do my best to understand. How does it hurt? Like tearing up a
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher-Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Start a discussion and follow us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod or on Facebook at Mind Matters Podcast. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.